You swipe your card, and a tiny fraction of a second passes before the beep, the green check mark, and your newfound possession. But somewhere, a number grows larger by an equally minuscule amount, and your financial future is quietly altered for the worse. You've been led to believe that debt is good, that it allows you to buy and use something today and pay for it with your future income. It's all a carefully calculated lie, one that hides its true nature extremely well. Its appeal is almost universal, and most of us are prone to falling victim to it in some way. But to truly understand how it insidiously twists our intentions and gets us to do things we wouldn't otherwise do, we have to take a closer look at why it feels so damn good in the first place. The credit card is the perfect gateway into the debt trap, and most of us got our first card in our late teens or early 20s. Armed with only the knowledge that it affords us the possibility of buying now and paying later. But few of us realize when getting that card that we're being promised only partial repayment. Economist Milton Friedman argued that most people act as if they have two types of income, one that is permanent and one that is temporary. As such, they tend to budget them differently, spending a bigger portion of the perceived temporary income on immediate frivolous expenditures. The same goes for the perception of wealth. Friedman's assertions had a certain intuitive appeal, but it wasn't until other behavioral economists started compiling research that supported his theory that it began to gain wider acceptance. Notably, Richard Thaler later found that when presented with the opportunity to separate the spending and the payment, people were much more prone to spend immediately and only feel the loss of the expenditure later. Credit cards were practically tailor-made for such psychological weaknesses, whether their creators had any idea about the intricacies of human psychology or not. But how does any of that affect you specifically? What should you, the average credit card debt-ridden millennial, care about any of this? Well, every time you make a purchase with said card, you're subtly conditioning yourself to think of that purchase as one that doesn't really cost anything. The feedback loop is almost instantaneous and reinforces the idea over and over again. But your brain, the amazing instrument that it is, evolved long before humans had the ability to engage in financial transactions of any complexity. And it still works pretty much the same way as it did when you were a caveman. 30 days from now, when the time comes to make that payment, your brain will still fail to grasp that this is anything other than a trivial expense. The whole point of this little exercise was to give you a more comprehensive overview of why debt is such a profoundly destructive force in people's lives, and how it insidiously twists your psyche to get you to act against your own best interests. But if you're anything like most individuals who have fallen victim to the debt trap, your realization will likely come too late to stop the damage from being done. So let's turn the discussion back towards the mechanisms that put you in the position to make such damaging financial decisions in the first place. As noted, the credit card industry didn't appear out of thin air, and there was a very tangible set of circumstances that led to its appearance. The catalyst was, of course, World War II and the period that followed it. Until then, consumer credit in the US was considered a fringe phenomenon, and people would typically buy large-ticket items with their current income. The situation began to change when wages began to stagnate while the cost of living continued to increase. People needed ways to finance their purchases, and credit cards became one of those ways. They didn't appear because the credit card companies wanted them to necessarily. They appeared because there was a demand for them. A demand that was there because people's incomes failed to keep up with the rising cost of living. But this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's studied economics, really. After all, the entire point of banks is to lend you their money so that they can turn it into more money. Credit cards are no different, with their interest rates steadily climbing month after month, year after year. And just as with regular loans, the longer you carry a credit card balance, the more money you'll be indebted to the issuer. Benjamin Graham, the legendary value investor and mentor to Warren Buffett, once famously noted that time is your best friend when it comes to investing. But time is also your worst enemy when it comes to debt, as the same forces that turn your money into something more valuable over time do the exact opposite to money you owe to somebody else. Compounding interest may be one of the most powerful forces in the universe, but it doesn't differentiate between money you earn and money you have to pay. Now, there's obviously nothing inherently wrong with borrowing money so long as you understand what you're doing and aren't misleading yourself about the costs involved. After all, you can't take out a loan to buy a house and then move out right away, not if you want that house to be an asset rather than a liability. This is true for most forms of debt as well, as there's almost always some kind of trade-off. If you're borrowing money to put towards something that is likely to appreciate, increase your income, or provide you some long-term financial benefit, it's more likely to be worth it to you in the long run. But this discussion is centered around the long term, whereas most people who fall victim to the debt trap aren't thinking about their retirement, or even about the fact that they've fallen victim to one in the first place. The debt trap in most cases takes effect long before you think it ever will, and it's rarely overt or easy to spot. It's most often manifested in the gradual increase of liabilities, without anything to show for it at a later date. Someone gets a small raise at work and consequently increases a bunch of their monthly expenses, failing to realize that their income is barely keeping up with their expenditures. Such scenarios aren't uncommon, but they tend to end with the person having a much bigger financial burden than they've originally anticipated. And the feeling of reassurance that comes with a steady income is rarely enough to offset it. In addition, the rising interest rates that tend to accompany tightening credit are extremely detrimental to the would-be debt payer, as they increase the cost of any outstanding balance. As a result, most people in this situation find themselves feeling as if they pay a substantial amount of money each month, only to realize later that the lion's share of that amount went directly into covering the fees and charges, not the principal itself. Why does this happen? What makes things so much worse for the person who wants to get out of debt? Well, it's all a simple matter of math, really. Compound interest is one of the most formidable financial instruments known to man, and its ability to eat away at the borrower's balance is one of the reasons why debt is so punishing in the long run. The same mathematics that cause your money to grow exponentially when invested, however, are the reason why money owed to another person will grow exponentially as well. Put simply, compound interest is a double-edged sword, and it's rarely useful to the person who has to pay it. If you've ever wondered what the single most important lesson from the financial crisis of 2008 was, it's that debt is far more precarious than most people realize, and that most of us have little to no idea how to manage it even in the best of times. Millions of people took out mortgages that they were unable to pay back, and billions of dollars worth of assets consequently went down the drain, both for the borrowers and, ironically, the lenders, since most of them didn't truly understand what they were getting into either. The truth is that debt always has consequences, no matter which side of the deal you're on. The more you borrow, the more you have to pay back, and the more difficult it can be to repay. This is especially true when you're in a weak financial position to begin with, so it's unsurprising that so many ordinary Americans found themselves in such a precarious spot back in 2008. But the point is that debt is insidiously simple in its mechanics, and even people with a comprehensive understanding of finance and economics can be caught unaware by it all the same. So what does this have to do with you? Well, the next time you're considering putting an item on your credit card, you probably have a much better understanding of what that decision signifies. In the next section, we'll briefly discuss how you can avoid getting caught in the debt trap in the first place, or, if you're already in one, how you can get yourself out of it as soon as possible. When thinking about the psychological aspects of debt, it's crucial to remember that most people think about money relatively, rather than absolutely. In other words, we tend to think about things in terms of gains and losses, rather than the value of the things themselves. Daniel Kahneman, a professor of psychology at Princeton, has found that most people have a much harder time grappling with the idea of losing something than they do with gaining something of equal value. In short, the feeling of loss has a much more powerful psychological impact than the feeling of gain or even the feeling of not losing something. In relation to debt, this could mean that people are far more willing to spend $20 per month than they are to lose $20 per month, which puts things like credit card debt in an interesting light. Most people who have fallen victim to the debt trap tend to think in terms of monthly payments, rather than the total amount owed to the creditor. And the former is much easier to psychologically justify, especially when you consider the fact that they often don't represent that much money. The same goes for the minimum payment, the one that most people pay every month without thinking about the consequences, because it's much smaller than the total amount owed, and for some people, it doesn't feel like paying anything at all. This is part of the reason why the minimum monthly payment is so insidious, and one of the reasons why people tend to underestimate the amount of money they lose to credit card debt overall. After all, the minimum payment only ever makes up a fraction of the total amount owed, And most of the time, it's much lower than any other type of fixed payment the person might have. To put it another way, the minimum payment is much easier to ignore than a lump sum. When considering individual purchases, most people fail to take into account the fact they're not paying only for the item itself, but for the privilege of spreading out the cost over a considerably long period of time. Credit cards and similar financial instruments allow them to buy things at an affordable price while deferring the remainder of the cost to a later date, one that may not seem particularly imminent. But in reality, that date arrives much sooner than most people are aware of, and that's when they realize just how much they've lost. Most people will find it hard to accept that they're losing money to a series of small, easily ignorable payments, since those payments rarely feel like actual losses. That's why it's crucial to understand that most credit card payments don't serve to reduce the amount owed to the creditor, at least not significantly. Instead, most of them go towards the interest, which is the fee charged for being allowed to use the creditor's money in the first place. This is why minimum payments are such a good example to analyze, as they're usually comprised predominantly of interest. One crucial step towards avoiding the debt trap is understanding what the costs truly are. This means knowing what the total interest on the outstanding balance due to the credit card company is, because that's going to be a major factor in your future expenditure. If you understand that, you're much more likely to reevaluate your decisions and only make purchases you can afford to pay for, either in full or in installments with another financial instrument. It also means understanding the true cost of any purchase that uses a buy now pay later platform, and how much you're losing to the convenience of deferring the payments. It's important to distinguish between debt that serves to increase your purchasing power or your income from debt that serves only to diminish it. But it's even more important to understand the psychological mechanisms that cause you to make these decisions in the first place. Most people in debt think in terms of today rather than the long haul, and they're much less likely to feel the pain of the losses in small, incremental steps over a long period than they are to feel the pain of a large loss that occurs suddenly. As such, it's crucial to recognize this bias and adjust your thinking accordingly. Remembering that every small payment you make towards the interest on the credit card debt you owe also comes at the expense of something larger you could have achieved with that money had it not been for the debt. The most important thing to remember is that debt should never make you feel good about a financial decision you've already made or that you're about to make. Anytime you take out a loan, you should carefully consider your options, knowing both the risks and the rewards, and remembering that in most cases, the risks greatly outweigh the rewards if the loan is used irresponsibly. You swipe your card, and a tiny fraction of a second passes before the beep, the green check mark, and your newfound possession. But somewhere, a number grows larger by an equally minuscule amount, and your financial future is quietly altered for the worse.